Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Shabbos Daf Gimel has three disparate sugyas, all within the discussion of what the maximum height of a beam across the entrance to a mavoi could be to allow one to carry within that mavoi. As we had seen, you need a beam or some other symbol at the entrance to the mavoi to be able to carry within the mavoi, even though it's a rishas hayachid. And we had seen that the opinion of the Rabbanan is that that beam can't be higher than 20 amas. And we had also seen that Rav explains that the Rabbanan derive their opinion from the entranceway of the Heichel, the main room of the Beis HaMikdash, which is described as having a doorway 20 amas high. And we see from there that even though something is 20 amas high, it's still considered to be a doorway. But more than that, we don't find that something higher still has the name doorway. So Gemara first is going to have two questions on the idea that Rav says this. That Rav says that the Rabbanan derive their opinion from the description of the doorway of the Heichel. Then the next sugya is going to be a discussion of what happens if the beam is actually on the line and it sticks out partially above the 20 amma line and partially below the 20 amma line. And then the third sugya is when we say amos, what do we mean? There are different size amos. Which size amos are we using? And that's going to apply to three different discussions of amos and try to prove which one we're using where. So first of all, we had seen that Rav says that the 20 amma height, according to the Rabbanan, comes from the description of the Heichel. The Gemara has two problems on this. Problem number one, the Gemara says, is that if this is true, that we derive the 20 amma height from the Heichel, then it should not help to have fancy designs on the beam. Because the Heichel's doorway also had fancy designs on the beam. And even though it had fancy designs on the beam, the max height was still 20 ammas. So when we're having a beam, if we're going to have a beam higher than 20 ammas, even if it has fancy designs, that shouldn't help. But we have a statement of Rav himself, who says that if you have designs on the beam, then it's enough. Because since it draws people's eye, they'll see it even though it's higher than 20 amas. But that couldn't possibly make sense if we're learning from the Heichel, the beam, even if it has designs, shouldn't be enough. The Gemara, first of all, says, who said that there were designs on the entranceway of the Heichel? The designs are on the entranceway of the Ulam. That's the anteroom of the Heichel, and that's the doorway of the Ulam is not what the Rabbanan are learning from. So the Gemara says it's true, but although the designs are described as being the doorway of the Ulam, we know that those same descriptions apply to the Heichel as well. Therefore, they're on the Heichel also. Now the Gemara says, how could you ask me a kasha from this? This is not a statement of Rav. I know you said that Rav is the one who says that it is okay to have the beam higher than 20 amas if there's a fancy design, which is what your kasha is based on, but that's a mistake. It isn't really Rav who said that. That's really a brisa. And some random brisa, we don't know who quoted it. We don't know if it's reputable. We don't know if you could rely on it. Therefore, you can't ask a kasha from it. So Abai says, what do you mean? We know exactly who brought down that brisa. That's Rav Chamer Breder Rabba Bar Avua who brought it down, and it's reliable. So you could definitely ask a kasha. The brisa contradicts Rav. The brisa says that a beam higher than 20 amos is good enough as long as there's fancy designs. And according to Rav, that we're learning out of the Heichel, it shouldn't be enough because the Heichel's doorway was only 20 amos high, even though it had fancy designs. So Gemara says, okay, Rav will tell you as follows. This brisa is not my problem. The brisa contradicts a different brisa because we've seen a brisa explicitly that says that if the beam is higher than 20 amas, it's too high, just like the door of the Heichel. So you see, it's not up to me. So it's not a kasha on me. And just like that brisa has to be arguing on your brisa, leave me out of it. So the Gemara says, no, not necessarily. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak says, no, that brisa wouldn't be a problem. The brisa that says that it's 20 amas high is the halacha, just like the height of the door of the Heichel. Doesn't necessarily mean that we're learning it out of the door of the Heichel. It just means that we're giving a sign. We're giving a mnemonic, something to remember what the height is. Just like the door of the Heichel, which we know is 20 amas high. But that doesn't mean that the halachos are linked. We could actually say that it's not learned out of the door of the Heichel, and therefore if you have a fancy design, you let it go higher. So the kasha really is not a problem between the Brisas. It's only a problem on Rav. The Gemara now asks if the source of the 20 amma limit is not from the pasuk describing the Heichal, so then what is the reason for the 20 amma limit? It must be because people can't see it if it's too high. If that's the case, then I have a problem on Rav anyway, because we have already seen the opinion of the Rabbanon, who argues on Rav Yehuda, about the 20 amma limit. We've already seen that as far as the fact that higher than the 20 ammas is not visible. We've already seen that in a different discussion, because we have a discussion as far as a sukkah. A sukkah has to be built in such a way that the schach is visible, because the Torah says that the reason for sitting in the sukkah is to remember that you sat in the sukkahs when you left Mitzrayim. So it can't be higher than the 20 ammas, because if it's higher than 20 ammas, you don't notice the roof readily, and therefore it doesn't serve the purpose that it's meant to. So if the entire reason for 20 ammas being a problem is because you don't notice it, so why do we have to repeat this machlokas about the beam over the mavoi? We already saw this machlokas about whether it's noticeable or not about a sukkah. The Gemara answers, I need the machlokas to be spelled out in both cases. If it only said it in the case of the sukkah, so I may think over there Rabbi Yehuda says it's enough to have it higher than 20 ammas. It's not a problem, because once people are sitting in one spot, they notice what's over their heads. But once you're walking, though, the mavoi, where you're walking under the beam, people aren't going to notice it because they're looking down at the ground as they walk. And if it would only say it in the case of mavoi, I wouldn't know that the Rabbanon say that there's a limit. I would think that the limit is only in the case of mavoi, where you're looking at the ground. But in the case of sukkah, I may think that there's no limit because people are sitting in one spot. Now the Gemara just identifies what is the design that was in the doorway, over the doorway of the entrance to the Heichel. So Gemara has a machlokes if it was a design of birds' nests on the beam, or if the beam itself was a very large, long, and fancy beam. Gemara says if it's a fancy beam, then you'll certainly hold that a bird's nest would work, because that attracts people's eyes more. But if you hold that it was a bird's nest, so then just having a large beam would not be significant enough of a design to attract people's eyes and make sure that they notice it, even if it's higher than 20 ammas. Now the Gemara asks, hold on a second, if it's a large beam, so why is that enough to draw people's eyes? We said that a sukkah that's higher than the 20 ammas is not going to draw your eyes, and in a sukkah the schach goes all the way across the top. So why doesn't that draw your eyes? So the reason must be, the Gemara says that the beam is made out of erez wood and it's very expensive, and therefore people are aware of it, they look at it, but just sukkah schach people don't look at, they're not aware of, it's not such a big deal. Okay, that's the end of the Gemara's first discussion. Now the Gemara wants to know what happens if this beam is straddling the 20 amma mark, the 20 amma line. Part of it sticks above 20 ammas and part of it sticks below 20 ammas. Is that good enough? You do not have the entire beam below 20 ammas, you only have part of it. So Gemara has the same question about the schach of a sukkah, if it's straddling the 20 amma mark. And the Gemara is going to have no less than 4 different psukim as to what the halacha is. The first approach is the first version of Rava, who says that in a mavoi, the beam of the mavoi, it's kosher if it's straddling the line, but in a sukkah, it's no good. The Gemara says, why not? So the Gemara first offers, maybe the reason is because we view the part that's above the line as if it's not there, and therefore you only have significantly the part which is left below the line, and therefore the Gemara says in a sukkah, all that you're left with is a very thin layer of schach, and that's not enough to keep the shade out. We know the halach to keep the sun out. We know the halach is that a sukkah has to be mostly shady in order for it to be kosher. The schach has to provide shade. If you halachically discount the part that's above the 20 amma line, you'll have a very thin layer. It won't be enough to create enough shade. So the Gemara says, but hold on a second, but in a mavoi you'll have the same problem, because you'll only have a very thin layer of beam left, and that thin layer of beam is not strong enough. The halacha is that a beam has to be strong enough to hold a brick and strong enough to stand in a common wind, so it won't be strong enough. So what must you say? You must say that even if you halachically discount the part that's above the line, you view what's left as if it's solid, as if it's made out of steel. So then you could say that for sukkah too. How come by sukkah it is possible? You're telling me it's no good, but by mavoi it is kosher. The Gemara answers, that's not really the problem. The issue is that if it's only a small part of the beam or the schach sticking below the 20 amma line, I'm afraid that it may deteriorate and rot and end up disappearing. And then the entire beam and the entire schach will end up above 20 ammas, and then it'll be no good. So in a sukkah where it's used by an individual one at a time, so we say that it's puzzle, because he's not going to notice, he's not going to remember the beam. of the mavoi, many people walk under it every day, somebody will notice, and therefore we're not concerned that it'll rot and it's going to disappear. Second answer is Ravina, who says that a sukkah is an Isser Doiraisa, and therefore we were afraid. We wanted to be very careful. We wanted to make sure that it's not going to rot. However, the Mavoi beam is only a halacha midrabanan. We're not so concerned. We don't have to make a zera that it may rot. Okay, now the Gemara's second version is to have this entire halacha, entire discussion flipped. And it's, again, Rabbah, it's the version of Rabbah, that the Mavoi is no good if it sticks below the line, but the Sukkah is good. And again, the Gemara asks why. The reason why the Sukkah would be good, the reason why the Mavoi would be no good is because you would say that I halachically discount the part that's above the line and I only look at the part which is below the line, and therefore it's too weak to hold up a brick and too weak to stand in a strong wind. But the Gemara asks if the same thing should apply to the Sukkah. The schach that's left below the line is too thin to provide enough shade. So the Gemara answers, therefore you're right, we must view it as if it's made out of steel, and therefore neither of those is a problem. The reason is that we're concerned about rot. And now we say like this: when it's a mavoi and there are many people walking under it, nobody notices because everybody thinks, okay, somebody else will deal with the rotting issue. But if it's your own sukkah in your own house, you'll take care of it. Well, the other issue is that since the mavoi is only an Isser D'Rabbanan, we have to strengthen it. We have to be very careful to make strong rules to protect it. Sukkah is an Isser D'Oraisa if you make it incorrectly and it rots away, so people will be careful and make sure that it's not going to rot away. Now, next opinion here is Rabba Bar of Ula, who says both the case of the Mavoi and the Sukkah are both puzzle if it sticks below the line, and Rava says both of them are actually kosher if it sticks below the line, because we have a Mishnah that says that the 20 amma height describes the vacuum of the Sukkah, the space below the schach. If the space below the schach is not full 20 amas because the schach sticks into the space, then it is kosher. And in a mavoi we say the same thing, it's got to be a 20 amma space. Says Rav Papa, there's actually a brisa that supports this psak. It says that a mavoi which is higher than 20 amas, the beam is higher than 20 amas, which is higher than the height of the doorway of the heichal, you have to lower it, and the doorway of the heichal itself was a full 20 amma space. The Gemara now concludes this discussion with a question and an answer. Rav Simi Bar Rav Ashi asked Rav Papa, how could you say that it's good if it straddles the line? But we have a brisa describing how you install the beam, and it says you have to place it from the 20 amma mark and below. That means that it has to be fully below the mark, on the edge, but below. It cannot be even partially sticking above it. So the Gemara says that he answered, he said, no, what it means is that it should be from the 20 amma mark and up, not from 20 amma and below, and it's okay if it is at least just touching the 20 amma mark and the rest of it sticks above. So the Gemara says, what do you mean? How could you say that it's 20 ammas and above? The Mishnah clearly says, the Brisa says, it's from 20 ammas and below. So he answers, that's referring to the lower limit of the height of the beam. The beam can't be lower than 10 tfachim. So in describing the 10 tfachim, it says that you can install it. It means to say you can install it at the 10 tfachim mark and below. It could stretch to below from there. But it's certainly okay if it is sticking into the kosher space, which is above 10 tfachim or below 20 amos. The Gemara now begins the third sugya, which is when we say amos, which amos do we mean? There are two size amos. There's an amma which is 5 tfachim long, and there's an amma which is 6 tfachim long. So which one do we mean, the big amma or the small amma? So Abai says in the name of Rav Nachman, there are 3 areas of halacha: sukkah, mavui, and kelayim. Sukkah is various halachas of the sukkah, mavui is various halachas of the mavui, and kelayim is the halacha that you cannot plant vegetables close to grapevines. So the psak is as follows. Abaye says we go l'chumra, we go stringently in all cases. We always use the more stringent rule, the more machmir halacha, and therefore it comes out that as far as sukkah and mavui, we're going to use the small amma, the 5 tefach amma. And concerning kalayim, we're going to use the large amma, the 6 tefach amma. Now the Gemara asks questions on each of them. The Gemara asks that it doesn't come out stringently in all cases. Each of them usually comes out stringently if you use the Amma that you mentioned, but there are some halachas which come out leniently, and the Gemara will answer either we don't hold of those halachos, those lenient sides, we do not hold to use Ammas there, or we were talking about most halachas. The Gemara first asks about Mavoy. The Gemara says you want to discuss which Amos you'll use to measure the maximum height of the beam and the maximum width that the opening, the fourth open side of the mavoy is allowed to be. Since you're measuring a maximum, as the most could possibly be, you have to use the smaller amma. That'll be l'chumra. That'll mean that your size ends up being smaller. But the Gemara says, but there's also a minimum as far as hilchos mavoy, and that is that a mavoy has to be a minimum of 4 ammas long in order to be able to carry within it. So if you're going to use the small amma, you're going to end up with a kula. You're going to end up with a smaller minimum. So Gemara says, so either Abaye and Rav Nachman, who he was quoting, do not hold that the minimum size is in amos. Hold that it's 4 tfachim, and therefore the size of amos is irrelevant. Or they were referring to most halachas of the mavoy are using the small amos, but not all of them. This one uses the big amma. Okay, next about sukkah. Sukkah, again, we have a couple of maximums. We have the maximum height is 20 amos, and we have the maximum length of a crooked wall. That's the halacha of the doifen akuma. The schach has to be close to the wall. You cannot have a gap longer than 3 tvachim of air. Now, if that gap is filled in with non-kosher schach, so we view it as if the wall extends all the way to the schach across the ceiling. It's as if the wall is bent across the corner and continues along the ceiling. But that length of pasal schach can only be 4 amos or less. Can't be more. So you have a maximum size there. So for that also, you'll have to use the smaller amos, and it's a chumrah to use the smaller amos so that your maximum is smaller. However, there's also a minimum. The minimum size of a sukkah. The minimum size of a sukkah is 4 amos. Less than that is not a kosher sukkah. So again, you should use, if you prefer to use the small amos, if you're saying that the halachas use the small amos, you're going to end up having a kula there. So the Gemara says either we are going like the opinion of the Rabbanon, who say that it doesn't go by 4 amos, the minimum size of sukkah is not 4 amos, it's actually 7 tfachim in each direction, which is enough to fit a person's head and his majority of his body and part of his table. And by the way, this is halacha. And therefore there is no minimum halacha which involves amos, so there is no kula. Or we said we're referring to most measurements, not all measurements. Okay, now the third thing we said was the halacha of measuring kelayim, measuring the distance that vegetables and seeds, grain, has to be planted far from grapevines or grape orchards. So the Gemara had said, Abai had said that you need to use the large amma, the 6 tefach amma, because this is a minimum. The grains have to be minimally a certain distance away. So again, the Gemara asks if there's a kula here. First of all, what are the chumras? Where does it make sense? That's as far as the halacha of a clearing in the middle of a vineyard or planting around the edges of a vineyard. The halacha is as follows. We have a clearing in the middle of a vineyard so that you have grapevines either on the 2 sides or on all 4 sides. So how big does the clearing have to be in order to be able to plant in the center of it? It's got to be big enough that you leave space around near the trees, near the grapevines for the workers to go by. That means that they can draw their wagon that they unload the grapes that they pick into, which is a minimum of a 4 amos. So you need a 4 amos strip around the edges of the trees. And you have to have enough space left for a minimum size field on each side. Now, what's a minimum size field? According to Beis Hillel, it's 4 amos, and according to Beis Shammai, it's 8 amos. Therefore, according to Beis Hillel, the space, the clearing has to be at least 16 amos across. 4 amos on each side for the workers to pass next to the vines, and then another 4 amos on each side for a minimum size field. According to Beis Shammai, that minimum size field has to be 8 amos each, and therefore you need 8 and 8, plus 4 and 4 comes to 24. So that's that size. Now, around the edges of the vineyard, meaning you only have trees on one side, you have a fence on the other side. So again, you need 4 amos space from the trees for the workers to pass. You also need 4 amos from the fence, because you don't plant within 4 amos of the fence, it'll destroy the fence. And then you need to have a minimum size field there, but you only need 1 field here. You don't need 2 fields. So according to Beis Hillel, that field has to be 4 amos. According to Beis Shammai, it has to be 8 amos. Therefore, according to Beis Hillel, you need a total of 12 amos space between the fence and the trees of the vineyard. 4 amos for the workers near the vineyard, 4 amos near the fence, and 4 amos for a field in between. And according to Beis Shammai, that field has to be 8 amos wide, and therefore you need a total of 16 amos. Now, either way, whatever the sizes are, it's a minimum. So if you're going to measure them with the large amos, it makes sense. You're going to l'chumra, you're going to need a bigger size. However, there is another halacha, and that's the halacha of the minimum space between the rows of grapevines in the vineyard. And that is a Mishnah, which we see where Rabbi Shimon says that you need to have a minimum of 4 amos between the rows of the vineyard. Otherwise, it's not a vineyard, and therefore you're allowed to plant grain throughout it, because it's not a vineyard. You have individual grape trees planted near each other. It's not an organized vineyard because you don't have proper spacing. So you have to be 6 tefachim away from each tree, but you're allowed to plant scattered throughout because it's not a vineyard. Now the Gemara says, so according to that, the minimum size, the size that you need there is a maximum. Meaning to say, the maximum space you could have between the rows and still be allowed to plant all over is up until less than 4 amos. If you have 4 amos, so then it becomes a vineyard and you can't plant anywhere. So over here you should use the smaller amos, not the bigger amos. It's a maximum. So the Gemara answers, either we're holding like the Rabbanon who say it doesn't matter how much space you have, it's a vineyard anyway, and therefore it makes no difference. You don't need 4 amos between the rows. Or we are just talking about the majority of the halachas of Kilayim, not all the halachas of Kilayim. And now the Gemara quotes Rava in the name of Rav Nachman. It disagrees with Abaye's version of Rav Nachman. He says, we weren't discussing whether the Amma is 6 tefachim or 5 tefachim. We were discussing what types of tefachs we are talking about here. Are we talking about soichkos or oitzvot? We were referring to happy tefachs or sad tefachs. That means tefachs of a closed, tightly squeezed hand, or tefachs of a loosely held hand, and therefore it ends up being a larger tefach or a smaller tefach. That's what we're discussing, and the Gemara will continue that discussion further on the next stop.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.